Hi, Misha here, and it's been a little while since we've done a Air Force One video or talked about a Chinese aircraft, and I just happened to stumble into this one. The Chengdu J-10 with one of the most interesting names ever, the Vigorous Dragon in Chinese. It's also known as the F-10 Vanguard for export customers, and the NATO reporting name is Firebird. And this is one of the current and more modern jet aircraft in the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force, and also in more limited service with the Navy. Now, I've shown you a model before from Air Force One of this aircraft, but that was one from the Chinese acrobatic, the demonstration team, so it was in a colorful paint scheme and had no ordnance. I bought it at the time because, well, these aren't very expensive, and I wanted a J-10 for the collection to kind of round out my Chinese Air Force, but I really would have preferred one with armament. And just out of nowhere, I happened to stumble into one of these at Flying Mule. And now I've got a Air Force One that's fully loaded up with something on each of the 11 underbelly hardpoints. So, just for fun, I thought we would talk about the plane, the model, and the Chinese Air Force. This Air Force One is 1/72 scale diecast, and metal is one of the things that brand does right. Comes with a nice metal stand with the marking on the bottom, and it's held together with a screw. Pegs in, simple and effective. And their planes are very much metal too. Very little plastic except for the ordnance. And even a lot of times the refueling probe and the pitot tubes are metal on these. The downside to Air Force One, they don't always have the best detail, and they don't often conceal their screws. And in the case of this model, it just comes with gear in the down position, kind of like the old Woody Wings. So they're neat, heavy metal, and they're quite durable, but not necessarily as detailed as a Hobby Master or even a Corgi. But Air Force One does tend to do a lot of aircraft that other brands just don't, including these Chinese planes. You can find a Hobby Master version of the Sukhoi Su-27 or Su-33, the Chinese J-11, J-15. But as far as the Chinese specific aircraft like the JH-8 or J-10 here or J-20, most brands don't tackle them. So Air Force One sometimes fills in the gaps, and it's kind of neat. This is a Chinese plane and the model's made in China, so kind of it's a little legitimate. And the J-10 here really is a domestic Chinese design. It of course takes cues from others, but it's not a direct copy, unlicensed or licensed of anything else. This dates back. It dates back to the very early 80s, around 1981, as China was recovering from the turmoil of the late 60s and 70s and trying to get their aircraft program and manufacturing back on track. And it was to be a third-generation air superiority fighter to rival the new MiG-29, Sukhoi Su-27, the Americans' F-16, and so on and so forth. And the way that China went about this was a little different. Previously, when the Air Force needed a new plane, the government, the committees, just assigned its design and development and manufacturing to a company. for the first time, really, they let the major companies in China compete for designs, come up with one, pick a winner. They also let the companies communicate directly with the customer, in this case the PLAAF, to determine what they want, what they can do, kind of cutting out the middleman. All very good things. So you had three major competitors. One company had a derivative of the MiG-23, or Su-24, a swing-wing aircraft. Another company kind of used the F-16 as its inspiration. And Chengdu here really used delta wing types like the Vigorous as inspiration, or some of the French and the Israeli aircraft. And they also worked on their canceled J-9 a bit. And in early 1984, it was the Chengdu that was selected for development and production. But things were a little slow because they're recovering and priorities and limited resources. So the government would not officially approve it until 1986, designating it as project number 10. And actual work really wouldn't get started at Chengdu until 1988. Things are not exactly moving quickly, although the collapse of the USSR and the Gulf War in 1991, other world events, did give a little more impetus behind it. Plus, China is rapidly recovering at this point. Nevertheless, the design was not finalized until 1994 because this required a lot of new technology. It really pushed the Chinese aviation industry forward because it required so many new components and manufacturing techniques. But by 94, they had it all ironed out and they moved on to the next phase. Work on the first prototype was underway by June of 1997, and it was rolled out of the factory in November of that year and was readied for its first test flight. They picked a test pilot who had a lot of experience with Western designs, Israeli designs, because it is very much based on those. And it would first take to the skies in March of 1998. From there, they would set up for mass production, with the assembly line coming online around 2002, and the first production models delivered to a training testing unit of the Air Force in early 2003. Interestingly, even though this was several years in the making, decades even, the Air Force actually received these aircraft ahead of schedule. So with that, they would start weapons testing late in 2003, and late that year it was declared to have reached initial operational readiness. But there were some minor changes that they wanted, so these were introduced into the design around 2004. And then it was said to have reached fully operationally readiness by 2006. And actually the government released photos of it early the next year, so 2007. So this wasn't meant to be hidden so much. And while it started off as an air superiority fighter, by this point it had evolved into a multirole fighter because, that's the 21st century for you. So, what did the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force get? Well, not a bad bird, really. In a lot of ways, it is very conventional. The main thing was it was designed primarily in China and built there. It's about 54 feet by 32 feet. As you see, it has a delta wing with no tail. It does have lower fins here for stability, a big vertical, and we have canards in the front that do move, and they move on the model too, which is kind of neat. They don't move a whole lot, but enough to adjust. They wanted to originally use the WS-10, which was a Chinese engine, but China had a hard time getting jet engines where they needed it to be, so they ended up having to go with the the Russian, originally Soviet AL-31 engine used in the Sukhoi Su-27 and, of course, the Chinese J-11. So, Russian engine. But they never did give up on the WS-10. It was quite modern in the cockpit. It had 3 liquid crystal displays, multi-functions. The pilot had a 0-0 ejection seat, had a Chinese-designed digital heads-up display, and so on and so forth. It was capable of achieving Mach 2.2 and a max altitude of right at 59,000 feet. As far as weapons, meowing cat. It had a total of 11 hard points, as I said. It could carry up to 13,200 pounds, although some sources say 15,400. Air-to-air missiles, like you see on the wings here, or air-to-surface ordnance, like in the middle zone, and up to 3 drop tanks, so 3 hard points are wet plumbed for extended range. Also, it had a double barrel 23mm cannon, essentially copied from the Russian. So pretty well laid out and quite flexible. Kind of reminds me, as far as the weapons loadout, a lot like an F-16, because this is not a huge aircraft. It's not tiny, but by modern standards. And the initial version, the J-10A, had a somewhat primitive radar, but the J-10B, which was being tested at the end of 2008, introduced a more active radar system. They had to extend the nose cone and made some other changes to it, but the radar is the big one. And they would introduce the J-10C about a decade later, by 2018. And it would continue to have advancements in electronics and avionics. Some countermeasures systems were added. And finally, with the J-10C, they started to produce these with the WS-10 engine. So a Chinese domestic engine. And those are in service quite recently, by about 2021. Also, the newer versions are updated to work with newer air-to-air missiles, as well as laser-guided air-to-surface ordnance. These can carry anti-radiation missiles, anti-shipping, as well as traditional iron bombs. It's pretty typical in that sense. And it's still very much in production today, with around 550 built and production ongoing. Of course, the largest user is the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force, who operates about 520 some odd. A good chunk, over 200, are still the original 10As. Around 70 are the J-10S 2-seat trainers. There's a smaller number of the J-10B, and a growing number, approaching 200, of the new J-10C. But the Navy Air Force operates about 24 of these, mostly the J-10A and the two-seat J-10S. Special navalized versions have been offered from the factory too. And China, from the very beginning, wanted export customers for this, hence the F-10 designation. But the biggest success so far has been with Pakistan. They ordered 24, and they were supposed to already all be in service, but just recently the first 6 were put into Pakistani Air Force service, so they have a remaining bulk still to be delivered and put into service. So this aircraft is still getting activated. And again, it's not a revolutionarily huge step forward. It's not super stealthy. It's not with a high weapons carriage. Of course, it has the typical performance benefits and limitations of a Delta wing with canards. Kind of a wasp-wasted thing here. You definitely see a lot of elements from, say, the French Mirage, late Mirages, the Rafale, some Israeli aircraft. And for whatever reason, it really does remind me a lot of the F-16. But, yeah, this is just one of China's current fighters. It's relatively lightweight, it's quite flexible, it's quite inexpensive to produce and maintain, easy to train pilots on. Just a good backbone fighter to replace older Sukhoi designs and MiG designs. And again, its story is far from over yet, but it hasn't really been involved in any frontline military engagements. Just patrols and training and all that good stuff. But I just had this model come in, so I thought I would share it with you. It's pretty neat. The model comes in totally pre-assembled. Like I said, the gear are in the down position. The wheels do rotate, which is neat. Just the rear. And the front do too. Got a little double wheel in the front. All the ordnance are pre-glued on, which, if I'm being honest with you, sometimes I wish Hobby Master did that too. Just saying. It doesn't have many moving components. We have the canards, also the cockpit opens up. It doesn't come with a crew, but I put a little Hobby Master guy in there because same scale, he fits just fine. And it's, again, pretty much all metal. The wing, the canards are metal. Tail's metal. And it plugs into its stand very securely. Although if you take it off the stand, there are some ugly holes where the stand plugs in. But then again, there's also screw heads, so it's just one of those things. I'm just happy it came in as a fully kitted up version, because that's really what I wanted. I didn't hate the aerobatic version, but this definitely fits my collection better. And since all of my Chinese aircraft, at least the newer ones, are Air Force One, it matches quite well. So what do you think? I know the J-20 and J-31 get all the attention these days, and they have some interesting features, but sometimes the old reliables are still worth talking about. At any rate, I appreciate you hanging out with me. If you could, as usual, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.